talking about this project that I worked on with the University of Bath's Critical Research in Social Psychology group. We're a group of broadly qualitative psychologists working on critical issues in social psychology and social change and community psychology as well. So very broad, and we decided to look at this idea of open qualitative data. So this presentation is called When Open Data Closes the Door, a critical examination of the past, present and potential future for open data guidelines in journals. So to get started, if my slides work, excellent. Yeah, I'd just like to thank all of my collaborators who are part of the Critical Research and Social Psychology group at the University of Bath. So we've got Richard, Joanna, Ralph, Lida, Monique, Abby, Constantina, and Zoe. And this project really wouldn't be possible without absolutely all of them. So thank you very much. And there's a link to the preprint here, which I think I'll post in the chat at some point at the end. And because I've been told this is sort of a journal club format, and because this was a collaborative project, I'm going to be mentioning actually quite a few quotes from the paper throughout, because I think they summarize the point the best. So there'll be quite a few quotes. But sort of just to start off with, so when we're thinking about open data has become a much bigger issue in the past sort of decade, but particularly the past sort of 5 years than it ever was before. And that's mostly due to the advent of the replication crisis in psychology. So that kind of broadly started with this article in Science, which was trying to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science, found that a lot of the key findings in social psychology and in other psychological fields didn't reproduce, so couldn't be reliably reproduced under specific circumstances. This kind of led to a bit of a crisis in our field about what we were observing and the conditions under which we were observing it. It is worth saying at this point, which is a point I will hone throughout this talk, this is very much a crisis in quantitative psychology, surrounding very specific quantitative findings. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for qualitative researchers later. But given kind of quantitative research has a lot of power and sway over what happens in psychology, over the past sort of 5 years or so, we've seen huge changes in our field. And these changes have been really prescient to me because this sort of article about the replication crisis came out just as I was joining academia. So it was just before I started my PhD. I remember being in the lab, receiving all this information and sort of being part of the response to it as well. So now we might be more likely to see these kind of badges that you might put on journal articles. So things like open data, open materials, and pre-registration. And I'm going to be talking about open data today. And open data is the notion that you open up all of your data. So you make all of your data openly accessible to other scientists, to members of the public, that kind of thing. And the idea is that by opening your data, you can show that your results are rigorous and that they are reproducible. And again, this is something that kind of has got a lot of support from professional societies like the BPS here. They have a position statement on open data, and many funders actually now require your data to be opened up. So my funder is the UKRI, the Economic and Social Research Council, and as part of my PhD funding, it's actually fundamental that I open up all of my data at the end. So when we're talking about this, we can move on to this idea of open qualitative data. Now, this is something that I found particularly tricky to deal with. And like I said, I'm a final year PhD student, so I'd count myself as an early career researcher. And because all of these changes are kind of happening as I'm learning how to do research, it can be very difficult. And I think opening qualitative data is especially difficult for a number of reasons. And the first reason is down to epistemology. So when we're talking about quantitative research kind of comes from this epistemology of positivism, which is the idea that there are observable truths out there that can be recorded and analyzed through quantitative methods broadly. However, when you think about the epistemologies inherent in qualitative research, there is a huge amount of diversity. And I should actually mention that I've provided 6 examples here. This is by no means representative of the entire field. And when we were kind of getting this paper through review, we constantly got told, oh, have you thought about this perspective? Have you thought about this perspective? From this perspective. And the fact is that quantitative research does have this broad epistemological church of positivism, but that's really not the case for qualitative research. There's a lot of different kind of understandings of what knowledge is and how we create it. So you might have a realist approach, which is this idea that what your participants tell you the truth, like is their representation of the truth. You might have something like a social constructionist approach, which I often use. I often do a lot of kind of discursive analysis that kind of shows that reality is sort of created through language, and how we say things really matters in terms of constructing reality, and loads of different kind of ways and approaches of observing knowledge. And not all of these are compatible with open data, to say the least. And another issue can be, for open data, can be what even is data? So these perspectives, this is a quote from the paper, but also a great paper by Morfner and Parry, which kind of goes into this a little bit more. Some of these perspectives might consider open data as aligned with research values and aims, whilst others will regard open data as absolutely antithetical to research values and aims. And we'll go into this a little bit more later. In terms of what else is tricky is what even is data in qualitative methods. Again, in quantitative research, we do have this broad kind of synergy in that most quantitative data is numeric in some form, and it doesn't need to be numeric at the point of kind of creation. So we might consider linguistic analysis as a quantitative method that takes words, converts these kind of words into numeric forms based on particular qualities. So some of you might be familiar with linguistic inquiry or word count, which takes qualitative data and compares it to dictionaries and then creates a numeric value out of that. But broadly speaking, most quantitative research is numeric in nature. And again, we have this issue in that what even is data for qualitative research? It's very different depending on your approach and depending on the project. So on one end of the scale, you might have someone who takes a realist approach to interviews that just kind of considers the interview transcript as the main source of data. But again, you might have someone from a social constructionist approach who is kind of more interested in the potential reflexive nature of the relationship between participant and interviewee. You might even have someone like an anthropologist who is more interested in ethnography, kind of observational reflections, all of this kind of stuff. So when we're talking about open data for quant, it might be easy to open data because the data might just be a data set and the materials might just be the survey. But for qualitative research, this is a lot more complicated and the question is a lot more complicated, which is basically what our paper is trying to say. And then we have another quote here. So, although diverse, we argue that there is utility in maintaining the category of qualitative research. The field is often defined in default as not quantitative. And I think it's really important to kind of take this approach of, there is a huge amount of diversity in qualitative, but I think qualitative research is often marginalized within psychology, and it is very helpful to kind of define it in relation to what it isn't. And it isn't quantitative research. And this paper by Madol and Goff goes into that relationship a little bit more. So open data is really hard for qual, and it's hard for qualitative researchers to kind of come to terms with. And here's a quote from our paper. The diversity of data treatment represented in this very brief sample shows how differing qualitative epistemologies and data collection methods shape the answers to the question of what data to share, as well as when, where, and why to share it. And another quote here. The imperatives of open science pose a disproportionate disadvantage and introduce huge challenges for qualitative research. Open science approaches and practices have been developed in response to challenges in quantitative research and with quantitative methods in mind. So I think it's interesting to think about the advent of open science as something that is largely driven by quantitative researchers, and our paper wants to kind of put the history of what the qualitative debate back into this situation of quantitative open data. So in terms of the roadmap for both the preprint that we've got and the review and this talk, so I'm going to start off with a kind of brief summary of these ongoing debates. I'm going to talk about the present nature of the content analysis of journal guidelines when it comes to open data. And then I'm also going to talk about future recommendations for improving the state of open data for everyone. And because I'm British, I had to get a Doctor Who reference in here because I love time travel and I love Doctor Who. So I'm going to take you on a time travel, hopefully. Cool. All right. So in terms of starting off with the past, now we split the paper up into these three sections because there is a huge amount of literature on what the challenges are for qualitative research in terms of opening data. That literature is not incredibly well recognized currently by quantitative researchers or by open science in general. So the aims of the paper is kind of threefold. One, to kind of shed light on these historical debates. Two, to kind of assess the current direction and what the field currently looks like. And three, to sort of guide what the potential future could be. And in terms of the past, we have these 4 sections, and I'm going to go into these sections briefly, but again, for more details on this, you should read the paper. So in terms of the first section, we're thinking about rigor and replicability. So what does it actually mean to have rigorous qualitative research? When we're thinking about quantitative research, rigor might be more analogous to something like replicability. You want to show that people can trust your analyses. So being open is actually really helpful for demonstrating rigor, because people can see the analysis that you've done, you can replicate it. But as with this is going to become a very repetitive talk, because again, it's much more complex for qual. So when we're thinking about evidencing qualitative rigor, reproducibility is actually not that important for most qualitative researchers. And again, I preface this by saying most, because there are some qualitative researchers who still really do believe that results should generalize and results should replicate. But again, there's a huge diversity in what people believe, and that's not the case for everyone. So in terms of evidencing rigor in qualitative methods, we might find these kind of practices like reflexive journals, providing audit trails of all of the decisions made throughout the project, and also member checking, which is this idea that once you've done the data collection or the interviews or the focus groups and analyzed the results, you go back to the community and kind of ask them, is this broadly representative of your own experience? And these are kind of approaches that quantitative researchers don't do. And these are approaches that qualitative researchers have been doing for a very long time. So this is not news to us. But in terms of a quote from the paper, congruent with good qualitative teaching and the work of Blignall and Ritchie, the goal of published qualitative research should be to reveal both the wood and the trees, such as a broad understanding of the phenomenon under study, as well as relevant idiographic detail concerning a particular element. So we might be talking about, that participants' very specific experiences relating to a broader phenomenon. And from this perspective, what is actually a bigger problem than sort of opening data is sort of the word limits that people face. So it might be the case that, you've provided this, you've done a project for 6 months, you've done this massive reflexive journal of every single point, but then there might be journal word limits on how much you can actually describe that in the text, how much supplemental material you can actually present. So even though qualitative researchers are already doing a lot of things to evidence this kind of notion of rigor, they're doing so in ways that can't be captured in the journal article as it currently stands. And yeah, there are huge constraints on your ability to understand your decision making through small word counts or page counts, or prescribed subsections favoring parsimony over depth and complexity. So one example I like to think of for this is that I have a colleague, Catherine Lee, who recently published a brief communication in Nature Climate Change about the school strikes. And it was an amazing piece of qualitative research, but she had to summarize it in 2 pages. And that's really great that she got that article, but it was a huge challenge for her to kind of condense everything that she'd done into this format to suit this journal that is really high impact and will be really good for her career. But again, it's really tricky to kind of work with the journals on this. So we wanted to draw attention to that. Okay, so the next point, adding further complexity, qualitative researchers who work in a social constructionist paradigm actually welcome this sort of notion that what you are doing cannot necessarily be reproduced by someone else. It can't be reproduced in a different time period, this kind of thing. And actually they welcome plurality of meaning as just one of many possible readings of the data. So actually the fact that your data is maybe different to how someone else would read it is a benefit in social constructionist approaches, because your research is a product of you. It's not necessarily even a bad thing. Cool. And similarly, researchers' readings and interpretations of the data must be situated in time and place. They are shaped by their personal, political, and theoretical positionings and will shift and change over time. Replicability is typically not a criterion for measuring research rigor and quality in social constructionist approaches. I think that's really important to consider, but again, it's the huge caveat that there are different approaches in qualitative research that would kind of approach this a little bit differently. So moving on to the next point, which is about this kind of reflective practice. So we're thinking about when we're evidencing rigor in qualitative work, we might want to reflect on our roles as researchers in kind of constructing the data and the analysis that we've got. But when we're thinking about open data, if we do consider to kind of open up these reflexive practices like our reflexive diaries, this can actually be quite a tricky thing and can expose you to a lot of, like, you have to be in a very vulnerable situation, because ideally if you're doing a really thorough reflexive diary, you're talking very much about how your own prejudices have been challenged, your own opinions have been challenged, and this can actually open you up to a lot of issues professionally and also personally. So this quote from the article: while such researchers will argue that reflecting on questions such as their own positionality and power are essential to understand the research context, in approaches where researchers are encouraged to reflect on them, making reflexive accounts open may not be appropriate and may have far-reaching implications. And then I kind of have this point: can one actually be truly reflexive and truly honest when you know that loads and loads of other people are going to read the account? And I think that's something, you know, ideally we would love to be able to put our most vulnerable thoughts out for everyone to see and to have no consequences, maybe. But the reality is that when you open data, you kind of open it forever and you kind of post that up on a website forever. And it's kind of thinking about how much vulnerability is kind of normative and accepted. And I don't think it's that much, honestly. So when considering the question of open data, it's crucial to consider what data should be open and why, what data is enough to convince readers of the rigor, and what are the implications of other researchers and other people kind of sharing this data. And that brings me nicely to my next point, which I think is the most important point of the entire paper. So if you forget everything else about this talk, please remember this bit. And it's the kind of ethical and political considerations of opening qualitative data. Now, I think quantitative scientists don't have to deal with this as much, because you can actually pretty effectively anonymize a lot of quantitative data pretty comprehensively. It's not to say that if you're doing a very small scale study on a particular population, you might still have some of these issues. But I think as qualitative researchers, we often go into communities that are very small, that are potentially very minoritized, that are kind of face a lot of prejudice. And as researchers, we need to be mindful of the kind of ethical and political context of opening data and collecting data in these contexts. So one example that I have here, so this is a recent, I think it's a law from Texas, from their governor, Greg Abbott, who was basically kind of criminalized trans children, and has also ruled that trans children who are supported by their parents are experiencing child abuse. And what this has meant is that, yeah, it's basically illegal to be a trans child in Texas. And this has only happened recently. So in the paper, we actually used a different example from last year, which was again from Texas, but was the Texas Heartbeat Act, which criminalized abortion. And if you're kind of thinking about these volatile political contexts, it might feel like the research that you're doing isn't actually politicized, isn't actually that exposing your participants to vulnerabilities. But in terms of political contexts that can change very quickly, if you chose to open your data on trans experiences in Texas that you did like 3 years ago, that data is still open today for people to read and to potentially identify people. And the same goes for things like anti-war sentiments. It might be safe in peacetime to kind of interview people about anti-war sentiments and make these kind of statements. But as soon as a country decides to go into war, it can become very, very unsafe for the participants of that project if all of their data is currently available. And we go into this a little bit more in the paper. I think it's a very nuanced context. But the broad point is what might be legal or what might be normative at the time of data opening. So this is the time at which you decide to post these transcripts or post whatever aspects of the data that you want to post, might actually not be legal after. You need to kind of consider that the data is going to be potentially open forever, and what that kind of means ethically and politically, I think, is really hard. And then this final section, which is on sort of decolonial practice and problematizing open qualitative data, leads on from the last point in terms of what role did the communities and participants have themselves in open data. Because when we talk about open data, we talk about it being completely open, accessible to everyone. But actually, this isn't always the case. So one example of a paper that I had as a reviewer had open data, but the data was open in a SPSS form. and SPSS is a proprietary software which you can only purchase on an academic license, or it costs like thousands of pounds. So if I as a researcher couldn't access that because my Mac refuses to run SPSS, then how are communities and grassroots activists actually going to get access to this data, and how are they going to use it? And are we just kind of posting our data to fulfill these journal requirements rather than actually thinking about how communities can use them? Yep, so this further point, if there's an imperative to open data, arguably there should also be imperatives within social psychology that data sets and the oftentimes paywalled publications that they are used in should be made genuinely free and open, and that they're made available in a location and a format that may be genuinely accessible and useful to communities, advocacy groups, and grassroots movements. And I think like open data is just one small piece of the pie of a wider movement towards accessibility of our research, and we need to be thinking about that. And the second quote here, decolonial approaches provide ethical critiques to data sharing. And this kind of idea of helicopter research, which I only encountered recently, but it's this idea that a lot of researchers kind of like helicopter into a community, take the research, do their data collection, and then immediately jump straight out, and they're never seen again. And this is a potential issue with qualitative open data in terms of you might even have your data used by people that you never even meet, that you never have any contact with at all. So it could be seen as an extension of this kind of colonial exploitation in which researchers go into communities, use up the resources and not give anything back. So we need to think about how open data kind of factors into this relationship building with participants that is so important to qualitative research. So that was a very, very quick summary of the kind of debates in this area. They are much more eloquently explained in the paper, so I'd encourage you to go read and we can have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. But it's sort of moving to the present. So I wanted to take a break from all the theory for a second. I want you to imagine that you finally got that qualitative paper written up that has taken years. I know I have quite a few of those. And you've been thinking about these kind of issues that we've talked about, the issues surrounding open qualitative data, and you're ready to potentially submit to a journal. So you go and you check the author guidelines and you end up with something like this. I think this is the European Journal of Social Psychology, but most journals kind of look similar to this. You have this huge amount of guidelines, most of which actually refer to kind of the formatting of the piece rather than the actual substantive content, which is, maybe a conversation for another day. But you might have this and you might try and work out, okay, well, where's the open data section? How do I treat my data in this case? It's not immediately obvious. So what I tend to do is I tend to Control F, find data and availability or something like that. And then you might get something like this. So data sharing and accessibility, please review Wiley's policy here, which then bounces you to another page and you kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to look at Wiley's policy. Wiley's policy looks like this. Says, okay, is open data encouraged? Is it expected or is it mandated? I don't know what journal is what. So then I go back and I kind of say, okay, EJSP recognizes the many benefits. All accepted manuscripts are required to publish a data availability statement, but it's really not at all obvious what amount of data sharing is expected, what that kind of data availability statement should contain. I think this is particularly an issue for early career researchers. So you might go into this, look more into what encourages, expects data sharing and mandates data sharing actually means. And there are very subtle differences between all of these that might actually depend on the way that a reviewer or an editor kind of treats you. So having gone through all of these kind of journal guidelines for likely multiple different journals to try and work out exactly where to send it, as an early career researcher, you might still be quite confused. And this kind of whole project sort of spiraled from a conversation that we had in our research group, which was, I think me and someone else were kind of thinking what are we supposed to do with our data? So we asked some of the more experienced researchers in our group, hoping that they would have this fountain of knowledge about how to handle the ethical debates with the practical issues of getting published. And actually we found that there wasn't really that much difference in understanding between early careers and mid-careers. So we had this kind of conversation, and the career researcher was saying, okay, so what do I need to do? And the mid-career was just saying, I don't know, I just made the transcripts openly available so that I could get published at high impact journal. And then the early career person kind of going, what about all these ethics? And then the mid-career person realizing with horror exactly the implications of what they'd done kind of unthinkingly without just to be accepted at a potential journal. Okay, this is a good point. And this is kind of why we started this, because I think journals are really important for kind of gatekeeping access to scientific knowledge. They're also important for gatekeeping who gets to continue on in academia. A lot of promotions or job positions actually depend on journals. So when we're kind of thinking about this wider issue, journals are a great place to look at, okay, what are the expectations? And there's a huge disjoint between the theoretical concerns surrounding open data and the practical reality. Yep, and this is kind of what I said, publication is an important means for researchers to gain esteem, job security, and to publish work which opens up opportunities for future research, collaboration, and real-world impact. They function as gatekeepers, filtering who has access to these opportunities and who doesn't. So what journals say about open data is actually really important, because ultimately that's who's going to decide what gets published and what gets put into the scientific record. So, and this is also a particularly acute issue for lone or early career researchers. So I'm lucky to be part of this research group where I go to with this question and start this massive project about what to do. But there are a lot of qualitative researchers who don't have that kind of support network, and instead have to rely on this author guidelines document as the sole thing that they can look at for advice. So yeah, this is really crucial to us, and it was a big issue. So to kind of look at where we were currently at in terms of open qualitative data, we did a content analysis of journal guidelines for open qualitative data in social psychology journals. We decided which journals to select by doing a Scopus search for journals in social psychology, which revealed about 332 separate journals. Huge amount of journals. This is actually quite helpful for me as an early career, because it meant I could kind of pinpoint, okay, these are the journals that I should be publishing in, like all of this kind of stuff. And then we filtered out journals that were not in English due to translation limitations of the team. We had a couple of team members who could speak different languages, but because not all of us could do, we decided to filter those out. We also filtered out journals that were out of print or inaccessible. And we also filtered out journals that were not a journal, were just showing up in the Scopus catalog for some reason, were not open to general submission, or that were review only. So kind of like literature reviews only, because we were interested in empirical research, which left us with 267 journals to analyze between 4 different coders. All of us were early career coders. I think at the time, 3 of us were PhD students and 1 of us was a lecturer, but we all crucially had experience teaching both qual and quant methods and graduate level. So this was actually done last year. And we kind of came up with these 2 categories. So 79 of the journals explicitly said that they accepted qualitative research in their guidelines. The remaining 185 were kind of unclear about whether they would accept qualitative research or not. And initially, we thought that there might be some differences between these groups in terms of qualitative research accepting journals might have a little bit more nuance when it came to their open data guidelines. So we kind of separated these out. In terms of the results that we found from the content analysis, we actually had this kind of pattern. So we had, broadly speaking, of the journals that accepted qualitative research, 60% of them did have this policy on open data. And actually open data was encouraged in 89% of those journals, and was actually required in 2%, which I think was actually only 1, but it kind of showed that even in qualitative accepting journals, open data is becoming standard and is becoming normative. And this was also the case for journals that were unclear about whether they accepted qual research or not. There was a larger sample here, but again, similar numbers, 54% had a policy on open data, 76% had open data encouraged, and actually 13% had open data required. And this is interesting because these are actually the ones that are unclear about whether they accept qualitative research or not tend to be the slightly more higher impact journals as well. And something that really concerns us is that if you look here, We actually started off this project by thinking that a lot of journals would have an explicit position on how to handle open qualitative data. So we actually had all of these codes about, what to do with open qualitative data, how people phrased it, all of that kind of stuff. But what we actually found is that most journals didn't even mention qualitative data when they talked about open data. They just kind of talked about data very clearly. They would talk about data sets, but they would not mention the kind of explicit challenges that qualitative researchers would face. So as you can see here, there were about 4% of the explicitly accepting qualitative research had some kind of policy on open qualitative data. Broadly speaking, this was just saying we recognize that there may be issues for qualitative researchers, and it kind of ended there. That was sort of all of the guidelines that were given, and less than 1% in this sample of 185 unclear about whether they accepted qualitative research or not. So what our content analysis showed was there was actually just a complete lack of guidance in these kind of author guidelines for how to handle open qualitative data, which, like I said, is a very big issue for early careers and lone researchers. In terms of also the open data policy, so Joanna, who's a member of our group, was particularly interested in this. Turns out a lot of these data policies are kind of created at the publisher level. So they're not usually personalized to the journal topic or the journal editors. Like Wiley, for example, would just say, okay, we follow Wiley's policy, and then you'd be bounced to another website, which would tell you about Wiley's policy. Yeah, so 73% of explicitly qual accepting journals and 76% of unclear whether they accepted qual journals made use of these external data sharing policies. And yeah, so there are a couple of notions of like what publishers were being used. And there were kind of broad references to the transparency and openness promotion guidelines. But from this, it kind of seemed that people were sort of doing a little bit of lip service to these open data guidelines, not really wanting to discuss it in too much detail. And also in all of these occasions, there was a huge amount of time dedicated to telling you how you should format a paper, and not a huge amount of time dedicated to telling you about how you should handle opening the data or not. Yeah, so there's a huge discrepancy between kind of the debates that I talked about earlier and the way that this issue is simplified in journals. Because we're qualitative researchers, we also did some reflections on the coding process, which were quite revealing. So a couple of quotes here: having to move between different sections of journals, instructions for authors, editorial policies, external websites, bouncing around, made it really difficult to understand what journals actually expected of authors. Someone said that open science to me often felt like lip service for many journals, or guidelines was just added in without consideration of the complexity of various methods. A couple of other quotes here. Sometimes it was quite vague, and there was this notion that the share what you can bar that's relatively stable for standardized data becomes really reliant on authors and reviewers kind of agreeing on what these methodological and ethical issues are in really diverse and idiosyncratic contexts. They argued that this flexibility, the coder argued that this flexibility was really problematic for early careers, and kind of you can get really easily lost in unwritten rules. Should we have a stab in the dark at whether the BPS think that our position is good enough, or should we make it open just in case? There was a real lack of clarity. More qualitative, there was actually a bit of nervousness in that some really qualitative oriented journals actually just skipped any mention of open data in particular. And this was quite concerning when given that there are clearly norms emerging throughout the field. This coder felt like maybe these kind of principles of open science are already being demonstrated by qualitative researchers, but these practices might not be too obvious, and they might not get a badge, or they might not have a data set available, but they might still be rigorous, and that might not be recognized, which is a problem when it comes to promotion and publication. Someone actually said that they don't have any better understanding of what qualitative data journals wish to be made available than they did before starting this project. So I think that says enough. We literally, all of the coders analyzed about 50 of these authorship guidelines, and the fact that they are so unclear, I think, is a huge problem in itself. So sort of to conclude on our data, open data requirements were often used as a blunt instrument without due regard for the epistemological, ethical, and practical nuances of the data. further definitions of what constitutes data even, and what form data sharing should take were not included. So we've got like a simplification of this huge issue. And another quote here, some may argue that opaqueness is the qualitative researcher's friend, who could argue with the fairness of leaving it up to the researcher. However, this fails to account for the power and the day-to-day exigency, wow, I can't pronounce that word, of authoring, reviewing, and editing. In a context where A, bias exists towards qualitative researchers, and B, qualitative researchers are aware of and also may orient to that bias, there are certain perils. And I think this comes into the late career who just publishes their data because they felt like they had to. You know, there's huge institutional pressure in a lot of cases to publish in particular journals that do have these requirements, and there is a level of power there, which is quite concerning. So I'm going to kind of finish up very quickly with some of the recommendations that we have. This is obviously a huge issue, and none of us were kind of saying that we could solve it single-handedly. I think it's just we wanted to raise awareness of this issue and then kind of get advice on what we should do next. We had a couple of ideas. So I think one thing that can be done in general is that journal guidelines and the open science movement in general need to engage a little bit more with qualitative research and potentially provide some additional guidance in their author guidelines, and recognize that the complexities surrounding qualitative research means that the open data question is not answered as simply as it might be for quantitative research. Also providing some more training for reviewers, improving the clarity of the journal aims and scope, rather than expecting a crude and ill-defined description of the availability. Journals might actually be able to guide authors towards including a more detailed account of the decision-making around open data and broader decisions about epistemology, methods, and ethics in the manuscript itself. And then the final sort of recommendation, I think there might be one more. We need to provide more accessible training and resources around transparent research practices. So I am someone who's sort of like become a researcher during this sort of open science crisis. And I think it's the case that a lot of people in my research generation almost have had to teach ourselves. And so I think one thing that we can really do that might help is to teach other people and kind of spread awareness of this at the undergraduate or master's level, so that when people do get around to publishing, we have a bit more evenness of understanding the issue. Yeah, more accessible training and provide practical guidance to trainees and reviewers. So in conclusion, I don't have a clean resolution to any of this. I think we embarked on this project thinking that we were going to get some clarity on what we should do with our open data. And what we actually gained was, oh my gosh, this is a huge issue and we don't know how to deal with it. So we're just going to put this paper out there and hope that it can start a conversation. And yeah, so I've kind of gone through the past, the present and the future of open data. We kind of hope that we can integrate the past and kind of recognize the existing debates and scholarship in this area a little bit more in our current practices. In terms of the present, we really hope that there's a broader recognition of qualitative research and also the role that journals play in kind of producing these power dynamics and potential research issues. And in the future, we really hope that kind of improving training and guidelines in this area can help people to understand this issue, because yeah, it was huge and it was really incomprehensible. So cool. And just to thank you again to my collaborators on this, I'll post the link to the preprint in the chat. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, that was fairly long, but we should have time for a bit of a discussion and questions now. So thank you, everyone. I'll mute again, Anna.
Thank you so much for that presentation. You were suggesting before you got started that it would be controversial, but I don't think it was controversial. I think it was timely, is the word I would describe for this presentation. So fantastic presentation. So I'm going to open up the floor to our guests today, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and jump on the microphone, or you can always ask a question in the chat box as well. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask in regards to what's just been covered? Our students know that we're big fans of questions. All right, thank you, Alexa. I was like, hopefully Alexa asks a question.
I don't so much have a question as a comment. That was a great presentation, and I've been waiting to see someone actually present on this issue, because it's something I've encountered a little bit now. And when you're in the process of submitting papers, you just go, oh, that's annoying, how I'll just go to another journal because I don't have time to think about this. But it's really encouraging to see that you've done this content analysis and reviewed and found that it is actually a systemic issue amongst journals. And again, being qual, it just comes down to the issue of qual as kind of a secondary consideration for a lot of high impact journals, I think. So I think that it's going to be a very important paper that you publish, and I hope you get lots of citations by annoyed qual researchers putting forth their case. But yeah, a very interesting presentation, and I think that you'll get a lot of impact if you present it elsewhere.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. I mean, I could just speak a little bit more to that point, because I want to, we really expected it to be a lot better than this when we started the project. And it ended up we had this whole coding scheme and all of this stuff and we just ended up not being able to use most of the things that we were kind of having these really high level conversations about, oh yeah, how should you open your data? And then it turns out the conversation in journals is just not even anywhere close to that. And I think, so we've submitted this as part of a special issue on qualitative research and open science, which is going to be, well, I don't know, we got favorable reviews back and we've resubmitted this paper now, so fingers crossed. But that's going to be part of a wider collection sort of talking about the issues that qualitative research sort of poses for open science. And I think just the amount of kind of power that journals hold and the sort of amount of time and effort, we talk in the paper about how, for quantitative research, it might be a case of cleaning up your data and then pressing go and making it public. But it is a huge amount of man hours as well in terms of properly documenting everything. And yeah, it does often feel like qualitative research has kind of been talking about this in their own circles, but kind of being steadily ignored. So we're sort of hoping that this paper will push it to the forefront again. And I think, I love the value of having a good review, I think is huge. So I'm hoping that we can offer that for sure.
And considering that ethics committees are becoming more and more risk adverse, and that we have to justify more and more the way we go about our data collection and data protection, to then just have it said that we have to make our qualitative data accessible after exercising such care in our collection approaches for sensitive data. It's totally at odds with the agenda of qualitative research and institutional ethics committees' agenda. So yeah, it's like it hasn't quite caught up to the values of open science yet, the pragmatics of data protection.
I think, the ethics committee thing is interesting, because I think at Bath, dobbing in my own institution a little bit here, but I think our ethics committee is kind of saying, open data is important and we need to open your data. And it's kind of well, there actually needs to be this kind of broader account of the decision making.
Yes.
And I think
do
that
you
is
understand the implications?
Yeah, and that is part of evidencing the rigor as well, because it might be that I do a lot of work on environmental stuff that is fairly, at this point, unfortunately, fairly uncontroversial. But there are certain projects, like I said, that you can kind of be researching and then one moment it's legal and then the next it's completely criminalized. And I think certainly my ethics committee kind of seems to be sort of catching up to that very slowly. But I think the problem is that when you open data up, it's open for good. And you need to be able to think about, the past, present and future context that your research is going to sit in. And that's really, really complex and really hard.
Yes, and part of the beauty of qualitative data is you don't quite know what you're going to get. You can ask a very simple, apparently straightforward question, and you can get anything in the response. And that response, like you said, could border on something that is criminal or could be interpreted as criminal. You just don't know what the nature of that data is going to be, and then the consequences of that.
Yeah. And I think in terms of ethics committee, I was seeing Twitter is not a good place for these conversations. But I was seeing some discussion of someone asked, should ethics committees kind of mandate the amount of participants you should have. In terms of the quantitative research, it's often the case that you should have high power to analyze a specific effect. And if you have less participants than that, maybe your effect isn't high powered enough, whatever. But as soon as you get into qualitative research, like I read a paper at one point that had like 5 movement leaders from Malaysia. And it was like, they are the leaders of the movement and they have been interviewed, which is like a hugely, really important sample to have. But on paper, it's n equals 5, and it's like, okay, these debates are a little bit more complex in qual. And I think because qual has so many different epistemological perspectives, it's often hard to unite qual perspectives, I think, because we differ so much, which is why I included that quote about being not quantitative. Because I think, if you can define yourself in opposition to something, then, you might be able to form a bit more of a social action connection, collective action approach. But yeah.
All great points. Does anyone else have a question? Or anything else they'd like to comment on? You don't want me to be asking all the questions.
I don't have a question, but I just, I don't know, I thought it was a really interesting point, and then also very interesting presentation. But something that I hadn't thought of that you brought up was when opening your data, ensuring that it's in a format that is accessible and open, not just for researchers. And I thought that was a really interesting point, to something I hadn't, considered. Like we're doing all this stuff with my studies at the moment with OSF and everything, and giving them the links, but they might not necessarily have, the understanding of how to actually look at the data if you're not a researcher or in that area. So yeah, I just found that a really interesting point, and probably something I haven't exactly thought of myself. So yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think because, Anna, can you? Sorry. Yeah, because I'm kind of like I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I have an interest I do a lot of quantitative work and qualitative. My PhD is literally 50-50. But it's an issue for quantitative as much as it is qualitative. And I mean, it's one of those things that when you start thinking about it, you really think, oh my gosh, like, Microsoft Office is not accessible to everyone. And it's kind of like, I think the notion of who are we opening this for is really informative, because there's a lot of like quantitative open data that actually, when someone who's trained in quantitative methods opens the data, you can't even reproduce the analysis because it's like a method that you don't know, or the code's not correctly labeled, all of these things. So I think we tried, initially we were kind of posing this paper as being explicitly about qualitative research, and we actually changed the framing a bit to make sure that it was kind of like, these debates are relevant to everyone, we're just using the context of qual because people in qual have been thinking about this already. But I think like in quant, there's also sort of a bit of a move towards like introducing reflexivity statements in your quantitative research, which I think is really important, because obviously with every form of research, you bring your own personality, your own biases to it, biases, identity, whatever. But the fact that I'm an environmentalist researching climate change most of the time, that's like an important part of the way that I do research, and I don't want to minimize that just because it's not appetizing to a journal. So yeah, thanks for your kind words though.
Thank you.
I actually wouldn't mind pulling on that thread a little bit further. In a sense, because in your presentation, you made a really good point about how the discussions around open science have primarily occurred in sort of a quantitative space, and the qual space has sort of been having their own discussions. And, these ideas around rigor and what is considered rigor is very different for qual, because we have different criterion, and we actually have done a lot of rigor in different ways in our field or in the qualitative space for a long time, such as member checking, which is something that quantitative researchers just have never done. So with that in mind, what would be one piece of advice or one strategy or something that you would love to see implemented from the qual space around your understanding of open science and what you've seen in your paper and your analysis? What would you like to be transferred to the quantitative space?
Oh, Ooh, that's a really tough question. I mean, it's hard to put one thing down. I think if I'm going to make, maybe this is controversial. Maybe this is the controversy I was shying away from. But I think a lot of this whole debate about open science and, you know, what constitutes rigor, I think is often about intellectual humility and kind of this idea that I think a lot of people, including qualitative researchers, kind of have their method or their analysis, and they knuckle down on that as the only way to do things. And, you know, I do discourse analysis. I know discourse analysts are especially bad at this a lot of the time. But I think that kind of ability of sort of the mixed methods researcher, or the kind of more pragmatic qualitative researcher, as we might say, to sort of reach across the aisle. And I think because qualitative research is maybe a little bit more marginalized and less common than quant, we have to, like, if we're doing qualitative research, chances are we've had to learn some quant, like at some point. But I've been to institutions that don't teach qual at all. And I think understanding that there are other ways of doing research, I think, is something that everyone should know. And I think this kind of, I talked about reflexivity statements, and just sort of understanding that whatever methodological perspective you take is one of many perspectives that you could take, and kind of questioning why you've chosen to take that approach specifically. I think that's the most important thing, you know, kind of regardless of what you do after the fact, sort of recognizing that the way that you do research is not necessarily the only way, and sort of using that as a jumping off point to kind of start going, okay, well, why am I doing it this way? What does this approach bring to the research area, and what does it bring to my participants that is valuable? Yeah, so I think that kind of, it's a broad answer, but sort of having that intellectual humility and knowing that you could do it another way, and knowing that you might be wrong, and being open to sort of discussing that rather than just shutting down and going, I'm going to do my method. I think pragmatism is always the way to go. I love mixed methods. I think it's nice to sit right in the middle of all of these debates and swing to either side, because it depends on the project, I think, ultimately. But yeah.
No, that was a great answer. And I think you make a good point around the qualitative methodology as well, in terms of it being taught at our institution. And now I'm dobbing in our institution here at Deakin. We do teach qual, but not to the extent that we teach quantitative. It's much more smaller in focus, and it's often taught as like and there's this other thing you can do as well, where we both know the diversity of qual is large and rich as well.
And we teach students from first year about levels of hierarchy and how qual is right at the bottom.
Yes. So there's
about levels of evidence and how qual is right at the bottom.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And so, you know, for a qual researcher, obviously we're like, that doesn't just quite work for us. But I do think opening up that conversation and getting quant, even if you never do qualitative research, to have an understanding of what it actually is, and vice versa, I think is a really good idea. And I do feel like there's some approaches or some strategies you can use in your quantitative research from quals, such as member checking if it's appropriate, or reflexivity statements, you know, things like that. Even for student theses, if you never even put it into a journal article, I think is a really useful practice, at least because reflexivity is very similar to the educative practice of self-reflection in terms of learning and growth. So yeah, I love that approach, and I think more discussion across the aisles would be great. Certainly when I was watching the open science debate, I was just finishing my PhD, and I remember thinking, I have no idea how I'm going to implement any of this in my qualitative studies, or some of the things they're saying doesn't even align with the qualitative approach, or actually qualitative researchers have been doing what they're suggesting that we should do, just in a different way, or not in a strictly, of course, quantitative manner. All right, so we've just hit 4 o'clock, so I think we might wrap it up there. So thank you once again, Annayah, for that wonderful presentation. I think we learned a lot about different approaches to open data and qualitative data, and the overlap between those two, and how we can really progress forward. Really good luck with the paper as well. Fingers crossed that it gets published, because I agree with the Alexa, it's going to make quite an impact once it's out there. So thank you once again, and I will stop the recording now.
Thanks, everyone.